speaking about Brazil because obviously I'm not Brazilian, but that was a beautiful performance. It was really edifying. Just to give you a little background, my name is Edward Nawotka. I'm a publishing journalist. So I'm a journalist who covers the international book business and media businesses, and I've been doing this for about 20 years. I live in Houston, but I run a literary journal, and it's the primary journal in English that covers the global book business. And it's funded by the German federal government, which is kind of a peculiar position to be in as well, because I live in Houston. But what's been interesting is Brazil has been very much in everybody's focus for many years in the books and media business because of the success of the economy. The economy has brought up a tremendous amount of people from poverty to lower middle class to middle class. And the biggest instrument that the government has put forward to empower people has been education, starting with literacy. That's been the most, say, top agenda for several generations of government in Brazil. And currently, you may have seen in the news recently that there's been a lot of unrest, particularly on the streets, because of the distraction that a lot of people feel that the World Cup and the Olympics has brought to the government because of the funding. But the biggest instrument that the Brazilian government has also used to try to instill literacy in the community is libraries, which has been a kind of interesting factor. They've passed a law that by the year 2020, every single school in Brazil will have a library. But Brazil, just to put it in context, very large, geographically enormous country. And like the United States, when you talk about anything to do with Brazil, you have to talk about scale. So the US and Brazil are very similar in that situation. When people talk about literacy, people like to look at models like Finland or Norway, countries that have essentially 100% total literacy, which is fairly easy to accomplish when you have 8 to 12 million people. But when you're talking about countries like the US with 330 million, a country like Brazil with 125 to 130 million people, it's a very different proposition. It's also geographically enormous, and a lot of the literacy in the country is concentrated around the largest cities, Rio, Sao Paulo, Porto Alegre. And when you look at Brazil, just overall, when we're talking in the context of literacy, you are talking about a population that has about 25% literacy. This would have, if they had a representative of the Brazilian government been here, they surely would have looked at me and disputed this, but this is based on research from one of the largest institutes in Sao Paulo. It's very serious, it's not propaganda. 25% literacy. You have a larger portion of the population that has what they call basic literacy. That's 25% full literacy. That's somebody who can sit down and read a book, read a newspaper, understand it start to finish. There is another 20 to 40% of the population, and this number is again variable, that has what they call basic literacy. And basic literacy they judge typically by whether or not somebody can read a passage of the Bible and can understand it. Now that's, again, a culturally biased way of testing things. But then you're also left with another 25 to 30% of the population that's completely 100% illiterate. So obviously it's a huge challenge. But the numbers over the last 10 to 20 years have been changing. They've been dropping tremendously. Full illiteracy is actually down below 10% of the population overall. And the next level they call, it's essentially functional illiteracy. It's somebody who can possibly read a bank statement, possibly go to the grocery store and read the signage, is maybe another 20 to 25%. So you're seeing a tremendous change in that environment. One of the biggest factors in Brazil is the government has, again, not only they're supporting libraries, but to do that, to have a library, you need to have a functioning book business. You have to have a publishing business that can actually produce materials and or learning materials and media to feed libraries. I mean, it's one thing to have libraries, another thing to have something to put in it. And so the government has done has made a concerted effort to support the Brazilian book business, and they actually buy about 25% of all the books published in Brazil. They don't pay necessarily a price that the publishers would like, but they do support it to the extent that they buy about 25% of the books produced in Brazil to the tune of about $650 million a year. means that the overall Brazilian book business is valued at about $2 billion, which compared to the US, which is valued at about $30 billion, it'll give you a sense of the sort of scale. Brazil has about a third of the population, but they buy basically about a third less than the typical Brazilian would buy, about a third less amount of books than the typical American. And we don't have a particularly high rate of overall book consumption globally, nothing to be impressed with. Again, it's a sense of scale. So but it's seen as an empowerment tool, books, education, learning. And you're starting to see some interesting things because it's a developing economy with a broad range of geography. And just to give you an extent of how difficult it is to get a book from Sao Paulo into somewhere in the Amazon or somewhere in the farther reaches of the country, the most popular way to order books, one of the most powerful tools is the Avon catalog. You know, I don't know if any of y'all remember this, but it's door-to-door book sales. It's still a tremendously important tool in Brazil. So in buying encyclopedias, getting your book in the Avon catalog is an incredibly powerful tool because people have to go door to door in villages to sell books. And this is not just a small segment of the population. About 40% of all the books in Brazil sold to people is through the Avon catalog or through mail order catalogs. It's pretty wild. And again, when you think of Brazil, you think, we have this sort of image of, towers and, beaches and things like that. But it's really, again, a country that has a broad range of diversity, both economic, social, and cultural. And it very much is a mirror of the U.S. in that way. You have language issues as well, where you have a large Japanese-speaking population. The largest Japanese-speaking population outside of Japan lives in Brazil. You also have French, Spanish, German, Italian. You have a tremendous amount of immigration to the country that has been ongoing for the last century. So you have, not only are you teaching, much like in the US, where you're teaching in English in the schools, you're also teaching it very often in other languages. And it's not necessarily Spanish, as people would assume. It's not, again, always the case, but it is a scenario. And just to sort of wrap up, I mean, one of the biggest benefits has been the kind of advent of digital publishing and digital ebooks and digital textbooks, and you're starting to see how the educators in Brazil are trying to really push forward the agenda of being able to use digital textbooks, because then you can get it to a rural community relatively easily. It's just a file. And so you have these tremendous digital libraries that are being built in Brazil and being supported, again, almost always with the backing of the government, to try to reach more and more remote populations. And what you're seeing is it's enabled communities that never had not only a library, but a university system or a higher education system or a vocational system to build up educational institutions, because they now have access, no matter the fact that they're 1,500 miles in the middle of the Amazon jungle, they have the opportunity to access the materials. Because it's self-empowering, they've been able to create educational institutions to educate the populace. And to the tune that you now have about 2,000 institutions of higher education in Brazil, which is twice as many as they had a decade ago. And a lot of that is due to the fact that people now have a much easier access, much more affordable access to information, whether that's through open source learning materials or through materials that have been sort of sanctioned by institutions of higher education in Sao Paulo and Rio and the major population centers. And for example, Amazon is a good example. Amazon, the company, has made some 40,000 titles available in a partnership with the government to institutions of higher education. But there are also other Brazilian companies that are doing the same. It's not just Amazon. At the same time, the Brazilian government has purchased some 600,000 tablets, which the goal is to give every single teacher in the country a tablet. Again, some of these numbers, as to do with anything in government, the numbers can be a little dubious. Nobody's actually seen any of these tablets that apparently have been purchased. So you always have those kind of questions too. But overall, I mean, you're seeing a situation where you had a populace that was, to a large extent, outside of the big urban areas, disenfranchised from education, from learning, from literacy, from that ability to self-empower. being empowered through not only government efforts, but through the changes in technology and the access to information. And it's a tremendous boon to the South American economy, because again, Brazil is the strongest and largest and most powerful country in South America, and it speaks Portuguese. So it sort of sits in its own little island, even though that island is tremendously large. So, there you go.